Let's dive in, shall we? This is another of our virtual Agile meetups. For anyone who's just joined, welcome. Good to see you again. I'm pleased to welcome Jim Highsmith tonight, one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto. Someone who has over 3 times the experience, almost twice the experience I have as I've been alive. Not to try and highlight your age at all, Jim, but just highlighting the gravitas that you bring to this conversation. Over 60 years of experience, not just with Agile, but delivering stuff in various roles. And a fellow adventurer. I love the photo you shared with me up on the mountain the other day. Made me envious, made me want to go climbing. As soon as my knee has rehabbed, I will be doing something active like that. Jim, I'm going to hand over to you now because you will introduce yourself far better than I. Welcome, and we're looking forward to the session that you're hosting for us today.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it. And I too enjoyed meeting last summer, and hopefully we'll do it again soon. So I've been recently introducing myself in a little bit different way than most people do. Most people tell you about what they've done. I want to know about what people have, who they are, as opposed to what they've done. I mean, I want to know a little bit about what they've done too, but I really want to know who they are. If we really think about the collaboration that's needed in our environments today, in our organizations today, in our teams today, collaboration is built on trust, and trust is built on some sort of relationship. And we don't have a relationship if you just know that I wrote a few books. So I like to talk about the fact that I'm an adventurer, number one, that Chris talked about. I've been an adventurer both in outdoor activities and in business. I've had a couple of pretty traumatic and dramatic career changes over 60 years. And I like to think I'm an adventurer of multiple different kinds. And I particularly responded to Chris yesterday, put out a post on LinkedIn. He now has a Scrum Mastery Pathway, and he's got an adventure on there with a mountain. And I responded and sent Chris a copy of me standing up on top of the mountain. So I think we always need to be somewhat of an adventurer, particularly if we want to change the world. By the way, I saw some of the answers to what's your concern about the future. Probably half of those were sociological issues that I probably won't be able to answer. I'll take a few of the other ones on this afternoon. The second thing that I really think about in terms of who I am is a catalyst to bring people together. I've done about every job there is to do in IT, from programmer to VP of consulting. So I've had a lot of experience in a lot of different areas, and I bring those together. I also have an engineering degree and a business degree. And so I bridge that gap sometimes between the engineers, the technical people, and the business people. It's been something I've done. And the third thing, so adventurer, catalyst, and storyteller. So I like to tell stories about myself. I like to tell stories about my clients, stories about other people. I find that stories bring an additional something to the description of just facts. Finally, as Chris, you pointed out, I've reached an age where my train of thought often leaves the station without me. So you'll see me glance at my notes from time to time, and I'm just checking the timetable. You got a question you want me to
just shared that photo, Jim, by the way, of you adventuring that you shared with me on LinkedIn. So you up on a very tall mountain with your hard hat. Love seeing that.
Yeah, that was quite a trip.
And you said, where did you say that was again? Where in the world?
The North Cascade Mountains in Washington State.
Outstanding. Never been. Okay. Someone's asking, what's the tallest mountain you've climbed so far, Jim?
Oh, probably Mount Stewart in Washington State. I've done a lot of my climbing in Washington. Mount Stewart was listed in 50 classic climbs in the world. And it's not a very difficult climb, but you've got to go across a glacier, and then you get to the climb, and it's about 2,000-foot rock climb to the top, and then you come off the backside. We missed a place coming off the backside, and we started at 4 o'clock in the morning and got back at 9 o'clock the next night. So it was a pretty long day. So one of the things that I like to talk about, is, we talked about it a little, is to give some people some insight into the turbulence that we're facing today and how the rate of change of technology is impacting other things. So, for example, NVIDIA, the AI chip maker, just unveiled a new chip that's got 208 billion transistors on it, and that's just mind-boggling. They're making transistors where the individual transistors are down to atomic scale. When I was designing electrical circuits in the 60s, we had transistors that are about the size of the end of a pencil eraser. If you took 208 billion pencil eraser size transistors, you'd have about 10 square mile area. So each chip would be 10 square miles, which is probably a little out of sight. The other thing that was really interesting, the NVIDIA CEO recently gave a talk on where they were and what they were doing. And he mentioned the fact that he has 50 direct reports. That's unheard of. If you've got 50 direct reports to a manager, you've got to manage differently. I think that's what says that, we have to manage things differently as we go forward than we have in the past. One of the other things that I just picked up, Stargate and Microsoft, Stargate was a $100 billion supercomputer just announced by Microsoft and OpenAI, $100 billion supercomputer. And why do they need something like that? It's interesting that the cost to train GPT-4 was $100 million. So that just gives you some idea of the investment some of these companies are putting into AI, and it's going to impact our future. We don't know how yet, but it's going to.
It's quite the story, Jim. Thank you for sharing that with us about that. So yeah, with the AI, that definitely is quite the investment for the future. I mean, what do you think about that? Like, how's that going to affect Scrum?
Well, how's it going to impact Scrum is not the right question. How's it going to impact us as people, as organizations, and the use of Scrum within organizations as an approach to dealing with some of the issues? And I think for a long time, I've talked about some of the, let's look for something here. One of the things that I've done over the last year is listen to a lot of the dissatisfactions with Agile and Scrum and SAFe and some of the other Agile approaches. And I've tried to get at the root cause of some of these disappointments. Rather than saying Scrum is good, Scrum is bad, what is it that's underlying implementations of Scrum or SAFe or whatever it is? What are the things that are underlying those implementations that are causing issues? And I reduce it to sort of 6 things that I talk about with organizations. One, Agile of some flavor has spread to about 75% of the organizations in the world. And what I'll talk about what Jerry Weinberg said in his law of strawberry jam or raspberry jam. The wider you spread it, the thinner it gets. So what I think we have done is we've spread Agile pretty rapidly, and the depth of knowledge out on the corners, out on the ends are pretty narrow, pretty thin. And so we have beginners teaching beginners. We have people out there that go out and get a Scrum Master certification and a year's experience and think they understand Agile. And so what I see is what I call prescriptive agility. That's where you sort of say, these are the 5 of the 10 of the guidelines, and you must follow these, as opposed to something that Chris does, which is continuous improvement. You put these things out there, and then you say, okay, let's see how we can improve that. So, for example, I was talking to a woman who's the transformation director for a major corporation worldwide the other day. And she was saying one of the things that they have done is they've given their teams a lot of autonomy as to what they do and how they go about it. So you may have a guideline that says we do daily stand-ups, but then the team says, what's the purpose of stand-up? What's the intent of the stand-up? It's to coordinate efforts during, on a very short cycle. If you can tell me another way of doing that fairly quickly and easily, go to it. And so this idea that we have these kind of strict prescriptive agile practices, I think, is one of the downfalls. But I like to say we've got adaptive practices. We always are adapting the practices to what we need. Another thing that I think has happened is, and I get this from discussions with a lot of senior managers and CEOs and CIOs, and is in any good organization, I think agility is based on balance. You balance planning with no plan, with short planning with longer planning. You balance different kinds of people. There's always a balance involved. And I think at the ultimate level, what the originators of the Agile Manifesto said is we have two major goals: to deliver software better. So that's the performance. We deliver better software better, and people. We advocate a healthier workplace. So there's a performance people balance. And I think to some extent in the Agile community, those things are out of balance. And that we've got more emphasis on the people side, on the collaboration, on making everybody feel good, that we've lost sight sometimes of the performance aspect of it. And that's from a senior executive position. Another thing that I've seen, let me just give you an example from a consultant friend of mine. He went into an organization not too long ago and found that they had 100 software developers and 98 project managers. Now, they had all those project managers because of two different things. One of which is they had functional decomposition of their organization. So the project manager had all of these dependencies among these functional organizations that they had to keep track of. The second thing was that each person, because they were so stressed, that they had 5 or 6 projects they were working on, which effectively means you can work about 20 minutes on every project every day. There was no prioritization. On a more reasonable scale, if you had the organization designed correctly, you'd need about 15 project managers, 10 to 15 for that 100-person development group. So I think you've got what I call the doer-enabler imbalance. And so the doers are the people who actually do the work. The enablers are those people who help them do the work. And so, for example, a coder or programmer might be a doer. A Scrum Master might be an enabler. And what I've seen is some instances where recently there have been reported firings of Agile people in the organization. I think it's one of two things that are going on. One, a general cutback, I think is happened in a lot of organizations. But I also think that a lot of them are redoing their doer-enabler imbalance. So they're putting more emphasis on technical skills and a little less emphasis on collaboration skills, or what I would call the softer skills. Another thing that I think is an issue is a hierarchical organization design. I'm really not going to talk about that much. And finally, there's a lot of confusion about methods, methodology, and mindset. Methods are practices or methods for doing a certain thing, like refactoring is a method. A daily stand-up is a method. All a methodology or framework is a gathering of methods to go through the whole delivery cycle. And you've got some like extreme programming that's extremely lightweight. You've got some like SAFe that are extremely heavyweight. Those are methodologies that are made up of methods. One of the things that was unique about the Agile movement in the beginning was that we had plenty of methods and methodologies before, like we had structured programming and we had waterfall life cycles. And so we put those together into methodologies, but we didn't articulate the mindset for that. The mindset for Agile is really the thing that we need to carry into the future. Methodologies are going to change, methods are going to change, skills are going to change, but the mindset of agility, of adventuring, of inspiring, of adapting is not going to change.
I'd love to explore this point of the doer versus enabler rebalancing that seems to be happening. I know there is an economic element here where a lot of companies are struggling financially and have cut back, but I do think this do enabler rebalance is notable as well. And I think it's easier to make that rebalancing decision for roles like Scrum Master or Agile Coach as enablers, because I don't believe we're taught well enough. Yeah, Agile Coaches and Scrum Masters aren't taught well enough how to articulate the value they bring. I.e., been working with these teams, this is the results that I've helped bring about. Here's how it impacts the wider company. Here's how it impacts the bottom line, in language that those who make those decisions can understand and appreciate, so they see the value in keeping those roles around. So it's easier to say, right, we're just going to cut 10% of our project managers or our Agile Coaches or Scrum Masters, versus if we knew those people were communicating their value well.
Yeah, I think value communication is one of the key elements all the way up and down in an organization. How do you communicate that value? I think there's another piece of that too, which is, I think any enabler in the future, and I'm talking about any enabler up to and including the CEO, from a Scrum Master or a project manager or an Agile Coach, all the way to the CEO, has got to be more technically able, technically knowledgeable now and in the future. When you look at all the new technologies coming down, AI is just one of them. You've got the cloud, you've got blockchain, you've got Web3, you've got quantum computers on the horizon. All of these things are going to interject another level of change in an organization, and it's not enough to just know how to get a group, facilitate a group interaction, or to spout the various steps you've got to go through in Scrum or XP or any of the rest of them. You've got to have that technical background too, and I think so. I think this move from doer to enabler, or enabler to doer, has a lot to do with technical competence also. I talked about some of this at a conference last year, and a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "Boy, you really inspired us, and you scared me to death, because we've got to gain all these new skills, whether they be soft skills or hard skills or technical skills or management skills, and we've got to do that more quickly than ever." So one of the things that you got to ask yourself is how you're going to speed up your own individual learning process. And I think that's an important piece of what you as an individual can do. You've got to take charge of your own skill acquisition process, and not just skill acquisition. Too many people think that it's just knowledge acquisition, but I'm really looking at what I call capability. What's the capability to do something? And capability is a function of knowledge. So you've got to have information, you've got to have the experience using it, and then you've got to know how to make some decisions around it. So it's a function of knowledge plus experience plus decision making, and that's where we're falling short in a lot of places. We have the skill, we have the knowledge, but we don't have the capability yet.
You mentioned earlier the Scrum Mastery pathway approach, and that, if we were to look to the future of not just Agile, but learning in general, for me, it's got to be geared towards more capability development. A lot of the standard way of learning these days seems to be, right, I'm going to go on a 2 to 4 day course. And yes, those courses might include elements of maybe an exam at the end and some group exercises. But at best, any course that's structured in that way is going to be more of a demonstration you've attended and maybe learned some theory. It's not a demonstrate that you can apply that theory, that you understand how it works in a real life environment. And it doesn't build a feedback loop with the person that's taught you to say, hey, I tried this is how it went, this is where it went wrong, so you can adjust, inspect, adapt, and do it differently next time around. And the mastery approach that I teach and that others teach, and I've seen other pioneers in the Agile world like Bob Galen and Tobias Mayer and others who are starting to teach over a longer time frame, their focus seems to be more on how can I enable you, not certify you.
Right. I think that's true. And you can put other people like Alistair Coburn in that category, who really is looking at how do you think, how do you learn, how do you do this more rapidly? And it's not just acquiring knowledge; it's that experience. And with that experience comes confidence that you can actually do something. And I think a lot of people have a false confidence. I mean, just the term master out of a 2-day course is a little bit of an anomaly. And so don't think just because you've got these certificates that you're a master of the trade. That really happens only after years and years, and it happens after over experience. So I think what you're saying is you got to practice those things. One of the ways I found to increase your experience more rapidly, and I've been involved in one of these learning cohorts, and we're talking about applying agile artificial intelligence to leadership. And we've got a group from the industry and some high-level consultants and a particular AI vendor. And we've got a consortium, a cohort that is really studying how to apply artificial intelligence to leadership. And that's a whole different set of questions than, for example, trying to talk about how do you apply AI to, say, project management or software development that are more tangible. It's a more intangible thing. So I'm finding that just working in this cohort is really an interesting way to learn. And so I know some of you have done this before, but find a person or two or three or four from your organization, get together and have a learning cohort. If you don't know anything about AI, put that on your radar or some part of that. You've got some technical, like if you want to learn about Web3, put a group together to learn about Web3. I think those are part of the way of getting an experience that's really important without, and so you take your knowledge and you share it and you share your experiences of using it. And that really helps a lot in terms of building that experiential or practice factor into your knowledge or into your capability.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that cohort style of learning because then I'm learning from others as much as I'm learning from myself. Right. It's, as you say, you identify a focal point, a focal area. Maybe that's based on some element of competency or skills mapping. What we're missing from our collective group's knowledge or capability, and then investing the time to work on that together. And why I think this works is it can be built around your own preferred learning style. So some people are quite happy to just read books and learn. Some people like to listen to it. Some people like to watch. But having a feedback loop with others that holds you accountable for showing back that progress as well, because I think accountability is a big thing. For me, can help lock in these learnings.
It's interesting. We have our weekly meeting on Friday afternoons at 1:00, and you'd be surprised at how many Thursdays I've said, oops, I better have something to contribute tomorrow. So I better pull this together. And it's been a really fun learning experience because we have a mid-level manager from a major tech company. We have a high-level manager from a government agency, got myself, and then one other person who's got a long time, well, Pete Behrens, who's done a lot of leadership training and consulting over the years. And so that group has been working now since about January. And as you say, I've done a lot of reading, but I've also done a lot of experimenting, and I've also done a lot of sharing. And those three things are really important that you put together. And, you know, we used to be able to line out sort of a career path. And what I found today is that you're going to have to, over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to have to learn a lot more different things than we've ever had to do before in order to survive and thrive in the organization. Just the different kinds of knowledge that are going to be necessary are really important. And that's another reason why these cohorts are so important, because you learn together and you learn from each other, and because it's far more complicated than any one person can handle.
We're seeing some questions come up from the audience, so let's take a few of those, shall we?
Sure.
There's one from Frederick, and he asks back about that doer enabler balance. Is that organizational agility to you? Rebalancing doers versus enablers?
Well, I think so. I think whenever, to me, the decisions about balancing are some of the critical agile decisions that people have to make, whether it's at an individual level or a corporate level. And so this balancing act is really important. And I just think we've gotten out of whack a little bit in some organizations. And so, for example, while we're doing some reorganization at the bottom level by doer enabler mix, I know some senior execs, CIOs, who have led some major transformation efforts. And one of their first things they've done in those efforts is, if you've got to change the mindset in order to get something done, the fewer people you have to change, the more likely you are to succeed. And the fewer levels of management you have, the more, without going too low, it's going to be better on your transition. And so they've gone in and cut out, in some cases, 8 or 10 levels of management, middle management. Bayer is another case. They just announced some work that they've been doing, the Bayer Corporation worldwide, and they have reduced their middle level managers and expanded their what they call customer product teams. And so they put in a lot more autonomy on these customer product teams. They've reduced the number of managers, and they reduced the number of I'll call them bureaucratic policies. So, for example, they've saved 50,000 hours a year by having each individual approve their own travel expenses. You don't have to go to a manager anymore to get your travel expenses approved. Now, they've probably got some checking going on in the background, some AI program. If you're too far out of bounds, they may come back to you. But you don't have to go through this approval process through multiple layers of management for travel expenses anymore. And so they've done things like this that have saved them an enormous amount of hours doing sort of bureaucratic stuff. They've reduced the number of management layers by putting a lot of those managers in teams, and they're trying to do this worldwide, although they've just started on it. So there are efforts like that that are rebalancing at the bottom and reimagining the layers of management.
If there's one thing that I hope AI and technology is able to help bring about, it is removing the need to do more of those admin heavy, boring, repetitive tasks that don't really add value, to free up time for people to do the cool things, the fun things, the exciting things, the things that do add value. So removing, these bureaucratic needs to approve expenses, removing the silly appraisal processes, removing the things that just frustrate, that they drain people's energy more than they amplify it, and using technologies to enable it. And it's not about having it's not about chaos and anarchy. There would still be, as you say, guardrails, boundaries. If you submit expense that goes beyond this threshold, there's going to be a warning or a flag or an email going to you saying, okay, there is a procedure here. This is what you need to follow. But I'm looking forward to that coming about.
Yeah, I think that's true. I know for me, and I'm just a single person out here working on my own most of the time. And it's really changed the way I work. For example, I do a lot of writing, and it's changed the way I write. So I'll use AI to do a lot of the research work. I'll write a draft. I'll put it to an AI system and say, get it to sort of make some suggestions. I'm always in control, and the final product is mine. But I go through several iterations that I might go through with another person if I had another person in the company besides myself that I could go to and say, would you edit this for me? So it's changed that for me. And I think it's interesting. I've written a couple of articles recently posted on LinkedIn. The last one was AI, you have time, but you don't have a choice. And that's really looking at organizations. There is some time. These things don't go as fast as people think they're going to go. I mean, they're moving pretty fast, but you still got some time organizationally to make these changes. But you don't have a choice you're either going to need a good AI offense, or you're definitely going to need an AI defense, because there are these AI programs now that you think about all the cyber crimes. It's just going to be an additional level of sophistication. And
I
then,
saw
for
a really
example,
good. Sorry, go ahead. I was saying I've got an anecdote relating to that, but finish your story first.
go ahead.
You were talking about cyber crimes using technology. I saw one recently where someone was able to deep fake, create a video of a CEO and have it responsive in real time, so that they could fraudulently get people to approve spend over a certain amount, and therefore get them to pay out for large things. So imagine a particularly sophisticated cyber criminal taking the images of of Google, deep faking a video of it, and then dialing into someone, a financial, a CFO at a company, and saying, hey, I need you to approve this spend. They approve it, pay for it, and then that person walks off a lot of money.
Yeah. There are a lot of companies now that, for a number of different reasons, I liken it to a football game. I know more about American football than I do about European soccer. But you have both an offense and a defense, and you've got to balance those things. You've got to have some offense and some defense. And in fact, some organizations, some big organizations like Microsoft and some of the banks, are setting up both white teams to do AI development work and red teams to figure out things like how they're going to respond to cybercrime and things like this. And then if you get this other thing, excuse me, quantum computing in there, these might not be the exact numbers, but somewhere along, you take a 256-bit encryption, you take a normal high-powered computer today, it'll take like 50 years to break that encryption. Quantum computer can do it in 10 seconds.
You're talking about brute force hacking passwords and things, right? So when you've got a 256-bit encryption based on typical computing performance, it would take 50 years, like elapsed time from start to finish, for them to go through all of the possible variables of what that password or that encryption could be. But with quantum computing, that's come down to 10 seconds.
Right. And so the whole area of development of cyber crimes, and then things like AI comes up with hallucinations sometimes, or it has biases sometimes. And so there was an incident with a Canadian airline that, one of their bots mistold somebody, and it was in a particular special situation. But those kinds of things are going to happen, but we need to have a red team looking at those kinds of things. And so you've got to have a defense, but you got to have an offense too, because part of having an offense is understanding enough about it so that you can construct a good defense. So, it's not, you're going to have a balance. So you've got some time to do this, but everybody's going to be doing it. And so you don't have a choice, really. And then the other thing I talked about is, if you failed at Agile, you'll fail at AI. And what I meant by that title was, if you fail to understand the mindset behind change and adaptability and moving forward in continuous improvement, if you fail to have a mindset behind that, then you're going to fail at AI too, because it's going to be having a bigger change that you've got to deal with.
Okay, so AI is going to play a big part, and other technology advancements also. Question from Emily, and I think it's particularly key because we were talking about the need to have competence and not just people that know the theory, know the rules of certain frameworks. Emily's asking, how can we get experience when it seems the standard to get entry-level roles is to have years of experience, and they're struggling to get their first chance in a role like Scrum Master, for example? What are your thoughts?
Okay, kind of rephrase the question again.
Of course. So the context is that it's difficult to get on the ladder for the first time, right? If people are questioning the value of certain Scrum and Agile roles, then it's hard to get to those opportunities if you don't yet have the experience.
Yeah, but I think
how can we get that experience?
Well, you've got to find that entry-level position somewhere. I mean, you don't get experience without experience. And so I'm not quite sure how to solve that problem. You know what?
So,
You know,
Richie, you've got
find
a
some.
comment to add.
You know, you've got to be able to show some experience, and getting that first bit sometimes can be difficult, particularly in today's market, I think.
So I have few thoughts to share on Emily's question. So currently, in some of the non-profit organizations, there are a lot of volunteering opportunities, specifically as a Scrum Master. So there are actually the teams. There are some products which are simple products. The teams are building, and there is a safe environment where you can practice your skills, and you can actually are allowed to make mistakes. So I think those could be great opportunities to practice how you are working as a servant leader, and then that reflects as some kind of experience on your resume. So that is, I have a couple non-profit organizations examples where opportunities keep coming. If that helps, I'm happy to share those opportunities.
Yeah, I think those kinds of things where you can get an entry level job, where it may not be any organization you won't want to get into, but it gives you some basic experience. Somebody mentioned something about mentoring. I think that's a great way to go once you get on board. Or, I mean, I've mentored several people that just came to me and said, you know, well, I'd like to have some help. Could you give me some help? So I think that's one way that, you know, you can give back to the community, give back to the industry, is to mentor both inside a company or outside a company.
If I could build on that a little bit, I think that the typical way to become a Scrum Master or an Agile coach is likely evolving. When I first got started in it, it came because I was working in a project management position at a consultancy. They had access to lots of clients who were increasingly doing Agile type roles. I was given an opportunity to work with another experienced Scrum Master and then take over their role. Right? That was just because the environment I was in, alongside some knowledge and experience in a related area. If you have zero experience to begin with and you just have the theory, you do kind of have to get that first opportunity. That can come through demonstrating your value in other ways, i.e. volunteering, apprenticeships, but also just demonstrating how your skills that the existing skills you have are transferable, demonstrating your desire to continuously learn and learning how to articulate the value you bring about. One thing I'll also add is that I think a lot of people hold themselves back. They have limiting beliefs. And I'll give an example. Jim is here today because I asked him, Jim, would you like to come along and give a talk here? My first podcasts with Lisa Adkins and Mike Cohen, I had no right having someone of their stature on a podcast that just started. But I asked the question, and often people are very receptive to that. Like you've highlighted, Jim. People ask you something, odds are you're either be able to point them in the right direction, or if you have the capacity, you might be able to help out yourself. So don't limit yourself by thinking someone is not able to, not willing to, or otherwise. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. To quote Wayne Gretzky and or Michael from The Office.
You know, when you were talking, Chris, it made me think about something else. I wrote an article about certifications several months ago, and because I had seen more and more people on LinkedIn with, you know, 6, 8, 10 certifications. And one of the things that I thought about was, you know, I'm not particularly interested in certifications, but they're sort of a marriage badge of some basic knowledge about things. From that perspective, they're important. But what I thought about was, let's say I've got 15 different certifications. I've paid money to get each one of those certifications. Maybe what I should do is take some of the money that I would spend for certifications and spend it on gaining experience. And that might be a consultant, that might be somebody that you actually had to, like yourself, that you had to pay some money to get the value of their experience. I know one of the things I used to do is when I would go in and do a workshop, 2 or 3 day workshop, I would offer people some consulting afterwards, and all they had to do was call me up. And I found that that didn't happen very often. Now, that was back in the days before social media, before we had these collaborative tools. And now you can do a lot of that online. But that's something you ought to ask about. Not only go to a class, but if you go to a class and the instructor, like Mike Cohn, I know Mike really well. And if you ask Mike, would he be receptive to a follow-up call to ask some questions? I'm sure he would say yes, just like I would if you'd come to one of my classes and spent that money. So think about those kinds of things too. How can I get experience as opposed to how I can get knowledge? You've got to do both, but think about that in terms of the experiential factor. The practice factor is being really important.
Let's have a gaze towards the future then. We've talked about some of the shortcomings of Agile in the current states we're in now. We've talked a bit about technology and AI. How do we reimagine an Agile and look to the future now? What are your thoughts, Jim?
Well, I'm part of a launch group of 4 people that really took this reimagining Agile thing and is trying to promote it. And it really has 2 flavors. Back to the basics is really about what are the pieces of Agile, whether they're the manifesto or whether it's things that have come after the manifesto, that are still important. Things like people and collaboration, is that still important? Yes. Turning out good products, is that still important? Yes. Collaborating with the customer, is that still important? Yes. Continuous improvement, is that still important? Yes. And those are all things that the Agile movement has thought about and taken in as part of the mindset of moving forward. The methodologies and frameworks have grown out of that, and those have grown out of companies or people's need to have some more structure around it. Some people need that more structure, some people don't. Some organizations need that structure, some don't. And so I think one of the things when we're applying agility or any of these methodologies is we have to ask our question, what's the context in which these things we're trying to implement in an organization? One of the ways I think about it is Carol Dweck has written a book on mindset, and that fundamentally people are 2 mindsets. One's a growth mindset that's basically amenable to change, and the other one's a fixed mindset. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. You need some of both in every person plus in every organization, but it's the overall preponderance. If you have an organization that's principally, say, 90% fixed and 10% growth oriented, it's going to be a very difficult time implementing a methodology there because the mindset's just not that way. And so you're going to have a more structured approach in those kinds of organizations. So I think in terms of methodology and where we're moving forward, we have to think in terms of what are the basic core principles and then extend those in different ways, just like we'll have to extend those into AI. We'll have to extend those into how we do data science. We'll have to extend those into other areas. And the methodologies and the practices may change, but I think the core beliefs, the core mindset is going to be what carries us through.
I think back to the basics for me feels like, what is the minimum viable governance? What's the lightweight set of feedback loops you need? Each of those feedback loops giving you an opportunity to reorient yourself. You're gaining new data, new knowledge that will help you adjust your future, your plan of what you'll do next in the pursuit of your goals. And I think a lot of people will benefit from behaving more like scientists than methodologists.
Right.
Which feedback loops are going to help us to achieve this outcome? What is the expected result we're going to have? What's the data that's going to tell us we're on the right track? And then experiment, learn, adjust, and go from there.
Right. And those things operate at every level. They operate at the level of you as an individual. They operate at the level as a team that you're working on. It goes at the level of the enablers at each level, from frontline managers all the way through mid managers and executives. At every level, you've got to apply that same process.
Absolutely. And then what you need is the bi-directional flow of information that enables you to respond and adjust accordingly. So if individually you notice something, you learn something, you have the ability to communicate upwards to those that might decide what we do next or where we need to reorientate, still allowing those that are delivering the work to have autonomy to decide themselves. But there will always be the need for a guardrail of some kind once things get above a certain level of either money or gravitas or otherwise. But allowing that flow of information so that when someone is stuck, for example, the team on the ground are held back by a block or an impediment, they can communicate that to those who can remove the impediment, and then those people can go and clear that path for them.
Right. And and let's say, for example, there's a project manager in there or a scrum master who are responsible for removing those impediments. If they can't remove those impediments for some reason, that ought to feed into the next higher level loop. Why is it that we can't fix those impediments? And sometimes there's a difference between impediment and barrier. And I ran into this issue about 15 years ago when I was doing a project in China. Josh Kurieski and I were in China for about 10 days. It was the toughest 10 days of consulting in my life. We walked in, it was a consulting gig, right? And so you think on a consulting gig, you're going to sit down with a few people and you're going to talk to them and you're going to do some consulting. We walked in the room the first morning and there were 60 people in there. And so we virtually spent 10 days teaching an Agile workshop and adapting it on the fly to their situation. And one of the things I learned there was that there are some things that you can take as impediments to be gotten to fix, and there's some things that are just absolute barriers that you're not going to penetrate anytime soon, and be aware of those and try to work within those barriers rather than try to change those barriers. Because one of the things I've learned in 60 years of doing this is that beating my head against the wall causes headaches. And so I try not to do that anymore.
That's those systemic things, right? So I think a lot of Agile places a lot of focus on, right, teams identify blockers, that gets escalated upwards.
Right.
But not enough focus on how to remove those blockers from being a blocker to begin with. So why are we not measured on how few dependencies or how many dependencies we've managed to remove from our workflows? And also, why are leadership not measured on the cycle time of the impediments that are given to them? Because it's all well and good if you're creating a system where teams are saying, hey, we're stuck with something, but then if it takes 2 weeks for a leadership team to even look at it or do anything about it, then the bottleneck's with them, not with the teams.
You guys also got to figure out what the issue is. So I did a gig in Ireland. This was years ago. This was probably 20 years ago. I did a gig in Ireland, and I was kind of brought over to kind of what was called fixed development, because they thought that they were having some problems in speed with which they were doing development. What I found out with a little bit of looking around and talking to people is what they had a decision-making slowdown, because anything that was of any real importance whatsoever, and some of the things that weren't very important, like feature list on the product, they had to be approved by the headquarters group in California. It would sometimes take weeks to make a decision. So they didn't have a development problem. They had a decision-making loop problem that they had to fix first. And so you've got to be careful when you're looking at impediments too, to make sure that you understand what the right impediment is to be fixed.
Very true. And there's some reflections in the chats around bringing things back towards empiricism. This is all very Toyota, TPS, pull the Andon cord like, and things like beyond budgeting, which enable fast feedback loops at all levels, or shorter feedback loops anyway. Are there any other questions anyone has that they would love to ask Jim? Feel free to either type in the chat, speak aloud. Victor, over to you, my friends.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Jim. Nice to meet you. Regards from Lima, Peru. I want a question for Jim. The question is simple. One of the biggest problems in many organizations in Peru is that give more focus to results and their objectives, and not the people that make it possible. And what about is, in your opinion, Jim, and what is the future? What is the future of those organizations?
Okay, I missed a little bit of that. Could you kind of summarize that question again?
Okay. Don't worry. One of the biggest problems in many organizations in Peru is that give more focus to results and objectives and not the people that make it possible. What is the future of those organizations?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know about the future. One of the things when I was writing my last book, is the last chapter, I started off thinking about I was going to try to predict the future. I said, no, that's not going to happen. And so one of the things I decided is I was going to use history to help people prepare for the future. And so I don't have answers to all the specific questions that you might have, but I do know that preparation and looking back at some historical perspective and how other people have done this, address this particular problem would be an issue, would be a way to go.
It reminds me of the quote you shared, because we were talking about the fact that you can't change the past. You can learn from it. That's what you shared in our little chat before we had everyone else join us. So you can learn from the past and you can use it as a way of perhaps predicting a bit of the future. But for me, I don't tend to focus too much time on trying to predict the future. I focus on ensuring that we have the mechanism in place for us to catch problems early and to course correct. So I see our feedback loops, our metrics, our data, our ways of working as our compass. And each little bit of data helps give us something. Are we still going towards where we want to go? If our goal is north, right, where that's our aim, we're going to achieve that goal. And we're learning from our data, from our feedback loops, from our metrics, from our performance, that we're angling more towards northwest. What's our next step? How can we reorientate ourselves? What can we plan to do to try and bring us back towards where we want to be?
Right, and one of the issues is that given the speed of change, those feedback loops are going to have to be shorter and shorter.
That's my feeling also. The shorter the feedback loop, the quicker you can learn, the quicker you can do something. And sometimes the decision isn't to do anything, but the awareness tells you something.
That's one of the things we talked about in the early days of Agile, because we used to do these big waterfall projects that might take 18 months, of which and I've actually worked in an organization doing some consulting where they had a project where they had done requirements definition. They had a requirements document that had taken 18 months to produce, and they had no features, no code yet. All they had was a requirements document. If you do 18 months to do a requirements document, you get to do requirements once. If you do a 12-month project with 1 month iterations, you get to do requirements definition 12 different times. And so you can get those feedback loops into how well you do requirements. So the fact that you're doing shorter iterations helps you in the learning cycle too.
And that's where I think the balance comes in. You want the shorter feedback loop, the shorter iterations, without those shorter feedback loops causing so much admin or extra meetings or governance to prevent you from actually doing the work and enacting the changes that you learn you need to make.
Yeah, and the other thing that I talk about sometimes is when you're doing the short feedback loops, you've got to understand the difference between iteration and oscillation. And I've seen teams sometimes just get into an oscillating mood where they're going round and round in circles and they can't seem to get out of it. That's not iteration, that's oscillation.
So Rishi, you have a question?
I have a question for Jim. Maybe this is a rudimentary question, but I would like to know his perspective on this. So, Jim, how would you define agile mindset to a newcomer? Mindset specifically, because it's not a framework or methodology. We all know that. How would
Right.
you?
I have an agile mindset, and One of the things that I started looking at last year was I saw a lot of things about an agile mindset or a leadership agile mindset, and they were talking about different things. And I wanted to differentiate agility from just good management. And to some extent, it's a matter of focus. What I like to say is that an agile mindset consists of adventurousness, inspiration, and adaptability. So I want somebody that's adventurous. I want somebody that's willing to take a chance, that's willing to risk, a calculated risk, not a crazy risk. Although sometimes you have to take crazy risks. But I learned that a lot in climbing. And one of the things about climbing is you learn how to take risk incrementally. If you don't, you're going to get in big trouble. In other words, you do slightly harder climb the next time, slightly harder climb the next time after that. You don't go from zero to climbing Mount Everest in one swoop. You've got to go through that learning cycle. And so you've got to have some adventures to you, which takes courage, risk, and some things like that. To get your ideas across, whether you're a tech lead or you're a CEO, you've got to inspire people around you. Not just people underneath you in the organization, but people around you. If you're on a team and you're the technical lead on that team, are you inspiring people with your ideas about where we're going and how we're going to get there? And finally, this thing of continuous learning, I call it adaptability. You sense where you need to go, you act, and then you adapt to where you adapt to that. So it's like continuous learning. So adventurous, inspiring, and adaptability are the three things that I think are most important for an agile mindset.
I have a question for Marwan. Beyond the agile values and principles, what do you see in how AI will change the way we organize for and do work?
Well, one thing I've seen people talk about is that teams will be a lot smaller. That you'll use AI as a assistant team member, and you'll get a lot of your knowledge base from that, and you'll actually it'll be sort of. I like the idea that Microsoft uses the word co-pilot. You have a co-pilot on your team. It may reduce reduce the size of the teams. I think it's going to make, as you said, Chris, I think it has the potential of making organizations more focused on high valued things that are interesting to work on than low value things that are bureaucratic in nature. If it can help turn that people side to a healthier work environment, I think that'll be a good thing. There's also the downside of that. It may cost some jobs. I don't think anybody knows yet. One of the things in taking a look back at history, I was looking at one of the historical technologies. In the 1930s and the 1940s, we had telephone operators, switchboard operators that had cables. They would plug into the switchboard, depending on where they wanted to call you. So you'd call in, you'd talk to a switchboard operator, they'd plug you into another switchboard operator in another city, for example, and they would plug you in to your final destination call. When they started having automated switches, that change in technology created a job loss of about 400,000 jobs that were switchboard operators that were now not needed. But now you had a whole new set of jobs that were created in terms of switch designers, installers, maintenance. You got a whole new set of skills that were needed. Some of those people made those transitions, but some other people didn't. And I think that's the downside of these sort of technology transformations.
You remind me of something then, but it's completely slipped my mind and I've got no idea why. So I'm going to move on. How do you give full autonomy to a team that's not cross-functional and teams that consist of contractors and vendors that are only around for the duration of the work for a defined time period?
Well, I think any team has three things that they've got to manage: alignment, autonomy, and accountability. And you can't have autonomy without accountability and alignment. And alignment means, are you aligned with the goals of the organization that have been given to your team in terms of how it's supposed to work and what their outcome is is desired. So you've got to be aligned with other parts of the organization. Autonomy is a word that's gotten, I think, overused. It's not that you're going to have, are you going to let a team at the team level make $1 billion decision for an organization? Probably not. That's a board level decision. And so one of the things that's important is to have a decision-making process in place that says what are we going to let the teams do, and what are we not going to let the teams do. So, for example, work at home versus work in the office has been a big issue since COVID. What are your guidelines around that? Maybe some people have guidelines that you've got to be in the office 2 days a month. 2 days a week. Some people have a different set of guidelines. Within those guidelines, maybe you have the autonomy to work in your own hours. In terms of alignment, it says what's the intent of outcome that we need, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. And so there are all these kinds of decisions that need to be made about what does autonomy mean for your team at your level, and it may be different for different teams at different teams. They have different compositions. Then the final piece is accountability. And I find teams more reluctant to take on autonomy than they do accountability. And so we've got to balance those things. That's part of the balancing act that I talked about.
There's definitely a contextual coherence understanding that needs to be made around, I guess, what I call guardrails for these sorts of things, right? So guardrails is a term I've been using over the past 5 years or so. Before that, I was just very, framework focused. Guardrails are more like, right, I expect you as a team to do retrospectives. I'm not going to tell you how often you have to do them, like leaning towards shorter than longer. But as long as you're doing retrospectives, you are learning from your data and you're iterating, that's fine. That's a guardrail. It's not saying you must do retrospectives every 2 weeks.
Right, I agree. And the difference is the width of those guardrails. And they may be different at every level of the organization. But that's one of the reasons, for example, that you need fewer levels in your organization. The more different levels you have, the harder it is to take those alignment issues and parse them out as you go down a big organization. You've got the supervisors at the bottom making $5 decisions, and the next level making $10 decisions, and the next level making $50 decisions. And trying to parse that alignment into those many pieces is a really difficult job, and that's why you get kind of stultified in bureaucracy, because you got too many levels of management.
This is reminded me of the point I wanted to make earlier, because we were talking about technology and how it's going to impact our ways of working, how we apply the principles and mindset. For me, rather than saying individuals and interactions over processes and tools, these days I tend to refer to it being individuals and interactions enabled by processes and tools. So these AI, the technology we're going to gain, hopefully we will use them to enable rather than it being a over or qualifier. Example being the governance thing you mentioned earlier, where we're going to strip out a lot of that bureaucracy for approvals, and we might have some AI or technology that's going to aid us in doing that.
Yeah, I want to go back to this for a minute, because this is a really important point that you brought up. This word over has gotten misinterpreted throughout the years, and maybe enablement would make it a better word. But the thought behind it is not that it's not an either or proposition, which is the way a lot of people have read it. It's an either or. You either have process and tools, or you have people and interactions. That's not it at all. One is more important than the other. So switch those things around. Are tools and process more important over people and interactions? And you can see right away that's not appropriate value. But the over is important because it helps you make decisions. When it comes down to it, Are you going to put money into people, or are you going to put money into tools? Or are you going to do both? But there may be a point where you make some decisions based on the fact that you acknowledge that people and their interactions are more important. And part of that is going back to what was happening in the 80s and 90s and how people were viewed in an organization, particularly in process-driven organizations. People were viewed just as cogs in a wheel, not as people. That's the way they were managed. And so some of the things that are written in the manifesto are as a result of what happened in the 1990s. And things have changed since then. And so the way you read it has got to change. There's two different ways of looking at the manifesto. One of the ways is looking at it is that those are words that are cast in concrete and they shouldn't be changed. Another way to look at it is a more interpretive approach. What was the intent? So when it says software is the output that we're looking for, I can substitute product in there. I can substitute outcome in there and be perfectly happy with it. And so again, it's the words are important, but it's also important to get the intent behind the words. And I think you captured that really well in the sort of description of the first value in your own terms that you did several months ago.
Are you referring to there's a retrospective format that someone shared, and it showed the values and principles, and it said, rather than focusing on a framework or a methodology, why not ask these prompt questions? How are we enabling individuals' interactions, right? How are we being customer focused more? And it was just that approach to it. You could start with that rather than starting with a framework or methodology.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good extension to the manifesto.
If anyone hasn't seen that, happy to share that visual outside of this. Are there any other thoughts, probing questions, builds, yes, ands, add-ons, or otherwise?
Hi, Chris. Hi, Jim. I have one question.
Got one more answer.
Yeah. So usually everyone loves to have a look at the matrix, but the leadership and the higher ups, they always love the numbers, the velocity. They don't see the value, and it sometimes gets very difficult to explain what value we have delivered instead of the numbers. So how you see this when someone says, okay, this is the number of story points you delivered, instead of saying that this is the value we delivered? So sometimes it's a challenge for me, at least, to answer those questions.
Don't get me started on this one. I've had a very difficult time with velocity for a long time. Basically, and just recently, there was absolutely the worst article in the world. It was put out by McKinsey and Company talking about programmer productivity. And that word is the wrong word for a knowledge and an innovation environment. It's a word for an industrial environment. So for example, the example that I like to use is, do you judge authors, one author versus another author, based on how fast they can type or how many words are in a book? I've got 1,000 words in my book, so it's better than your book because it's only got 500 words. You know, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do with velocity. Velocity has a place in terms of for a team to try to estimate how much capability or capacity they have for the next iteration. That's a valid use of velocity. Value, and part of the problem with value is that it's harder numbers to come up with, and they're fuzzier numbers. And people like accounting precise numbers. But I always say it's better to measure something that's important than something that's easy to measure. Let me just give you one instance of how I applied that value orientation in a particular environment. I was working with a team in London. This is when I worked for ThoughtWorks back in 2010, 2011. And I wanted to visit a team and see how they were doing. So they put me in this team and I went to visit them. And I was looking at everything they were doing, and they were explaining their project to me. And I said, and how's the project going? And they said, well, we think it's going really well. And I said, okay, so how does the customer think you're doing? And they said, yeah, the customer thinks we're doing pretty well. we just get beat up once in a while on velocity. I said, well, what do you report to them? And they said, velocity. And so I said, try this very simple, on every, we use cards in those instances, in those back in the early days, 3x5 cards, and now they use Jira or whatever. We use cards and paste them on the board. I said, take each one of your 3x5 cards and sit down with your customer, your user, your product owner. I don't think we called them product owners back then. And I said, get them to assign a star on this card, 1 to 5 stars, and those are your value stars. And then I said, besides just velocity, report how many value stars you delivered each iteration. And I called them up about 2 months later and I said, how's it going? And they said, fine. They really like the value stars. And I said, are they complaining about velocity? And they said, no, they've quit complaining about velocity completely. Value is hard to get across, but it's something we got to continually work at to do better at.
True. Thanks, Jim.
I think this is where being scientific, as I mentioned earlier, comes in again. We're going to build X feature. We're going to invest X time building something new. What value do we expect we're going to gain from it? When are we going to measure that? Because there's not a customer out there who cares how many story points you built. They care about how your product made them feel, how it helped them, how it saved them time or energy or made their lives more enjoyable. No one buys story points unless you are a consultancy selling story points on some sort of interesting commercial model. And I have seen that, by the way. And Fortune says, don't talk about story points, make finance and sales your friends. They will tell you the dollar value of the improvements that you've made and what you've delivered, and then pass that report on to management. One way of doing it. Any final thoughts to leave us with then, Jim, on the future of Agile and reimagining it?
Well, I just think when we started doing this, the launch group, we thought about it, we're going to expand the group. Then we thought, no, we don't want to get involved in the implementation. We want that to go out to the community. And who would we pick anyway? So for example, today, the Agile community is huge. When we started this back in the 2000, it was very, very small. It was a small group of people. And believe me, we got sticks and stones thrown at us a lot back then. We didn't have the social media they have today, so it was a lot more limited. The only thing we would do is go to conferences and write papers and those kinds of things. But we got lots of stones thrown at us at conferences. So it wasn't all peaches and cream back then either. But I think today, with the number of people involved in Agile, that there are multiple different ways to do it right, or to extend it in the right way, using the core principles as a jumping off place. And so I keep beating this horse and talking about mindset, but I think that's really the fundamental thing that we carry forward into the future. And I oscillate from being very hopeful about the future to being kind of pessimistic, as some of the early "what are you concerned about your future" questions pointed out. But I think that's something that I think being more agile, being more open, being open to continuous improvement is something that a lot of different people can use. And so I'd like to see those concepts more widely used, not only in our industry, but throughout organizations.
Amazing. There's a final question I just want to ask, because I think it's a really good one. It's from Helena. What is the important question that we are not asking?
After some hour and 20 minutes, I'm not sure my brain's going to gear up for that one. I'm not coming up with anything.
All right. You and I can have a chat about that over a beer next time I see you. See if we can come up with anything interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Oh, final question.
Yeah, I don't expect an answer for this one. This is more of a kind of a challenge for Jim, if he likes. select challenges, what would be a topic you'd like to attend a presentation or workshop on in the coming month? Just think about it, and if you want to share it now, or you want to share it with us later.
Something that I would like to attend?
Yeah, something if you are going to attend something, you would love if that was the topic, or
Well, I'm presenting and helping to plan a conference in the fall in Lisbon, Portugal, on the World Management Agility Forum. And so I'm the most interested in how you apply some of these both agile mindset and artificial intelligence capabilities to leadership and management. And so that's really anything that has to deal with those areas, I think, are things that I'm particularly interested in coming up. How do you apply AI in situations where you're actually augmenting human intelligence? And then the big question is, can we do it, and should we do it? So those are the kinds of questions, kinds of things that I'm interested in.
Jim, you're organizing a conference in Lisbon and you haven't invited me. I'm crushed. I jest. I'll have to look out for a call for proposal, and I'll use your ideas there as to what you'd like to see as inspiration.
Well, I'm also going to be at the Go to Copenhagen conference in the first part of October.
Amazing.
That's more of a developer.
Right.
Developer one. Conference. But I guess
so
to see
folks,
my buddy Martin Fowler. Martin and I have been friends for 20 plus years, and we first met in New Zealand.
Outstanding. I haven't met Martin yet. Hopefully sometime. I think given the time, we're going to close things off. Thank you everyone for joining, asking your questions, sharing your concerns about the future of Agile, actively engaging in the chat and sharing all your insights. There's people who have been offering support to Scrum Masters to get experience and mentoring. There's been lots of really good discussions held today. The recording of this will be shared on the YouTube YouTube channel, so you can catch it up if there was anything you missed or anything you want to recap on. Our next session is on Thursday this week, so 2 days' time, with Martin Dalmeen on the power of sprint goals and humble planning. I've re-enabled the soundboard for reactions, so please share your appreciation for Jim Highsmith for his time that he's kindly donated with us today to share about Reimagine Agile. Either, there you go, sound reactions or the other reactions, do your thing.
Thanks, Chris, I really enjoyed it.
Until next time, folks, a pleasure.